The cold came early that October. It crept down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains before the leaves had finished turning, pushing a gray wall of cloud across the New Mexico sky that blocked out the sun for 3 days straight. The cattle felt it first. They gathered near the south fence in dark, patient clusters, pressing their broad sides together, their breath rising in thin white threads above their backs. The grass had gone brittle and pale. The ground cracked in the mornings now the way old leather cracks when it dries too long in the wind, deep and irreversible, the kind of cracking that does not heal when the moisture returns. Jasper Lorne woke before 4, as he always did. He lay still for a moment in the darkness, listening to the house around him. It was a particular kind of silence, one that had taken him the better part of 3 years to stop fighting. Not the comfortable silence of a man at peace under his own roof, but the silence of rooms that had once held something warm and no longer did. The silence of a chair that had not moved from its place by the window in 37 months. The silence of a coffee cup that sat on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet, the blue one with the small chip on the handle, exactly where it had been left on the morning of January 19, 1878, and had not been touched since. He sat up slowly, pulling on his boots in the dark without needing the lamp, and walked to the kitchen. He built the fire in the stove from the coals he always banked before sleep, a habit so ingrained it required no thought, and set the coffee pot on the iron surface, and stood beside it with his arms folded, watching the orange glow pulse through the grate. He was 38 years old. In the pale pre-dawn light that began to seep through the single east-facing window, he looked it, and then some. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there in his early 30s. His dark hair had gone gray at both temples, not gradually, but in a way that seemed to have happened all at once, the way certain changes arrive, not as a process, but as a verdict. His hands were rough and scarred from 3 years of ranch work done without pause, because pausing was a luxury available to men who had someone to pause with. He poured his coffee and carried it to the back door and pushed it open. The morning was still and very cold. He stepped out onto the wooden step and stood there with the cup in both hands, letting the steam rise against his face. He looked out across the yard, past the dark shape of the barn, past the silent stock tank, past the dying kitchen garden he had not bothered to tend since early summer, to the far south end of the property where a large cottonwood tree stood at the edge of the dry grass. The cottonwood's roots ran deep enough to find water that the drought had not reached, and its trunk was wide and old, and its bark was silver-gray in the pre-dawn darkness. At the base of that tree stood 2 markers of flat sandstone set low to the ground. Clara had not wanted anything tall. She had told him that in the last winter of her life, half asleep one evening with her head against his shoulder, her voice already thinner than it should have been for a woman of 29, she had said she wanted something that looked as though it had always been there, as though it belonged to the land instead of interrupting it. He had not understood fully what she meant at the time. He understood it now. He stood with the coffee going cold in his hands and looked at the 2 stones. Clara Lorne. Beside her, barely a foot away, and slightly smaller, the second stone. William Lorne. 4 years old. The fever had come through in the 3rd week of January, spreading from the settlement at the river crossing up through the farms and ranches in the valley. It moved with a speed that outpaced any response. The doctor from Taos arrived 3 days after Clara went down. He arrived 1 day after William. He was a decent man, and he was sorry, and Jasper had thanked him and paid him and watched him ride back south, and then he had gone out to the south end of the yard and stood exactly where he was standing now, and remained there until the cold forced him inside. He had thought in the months that followed that the grief would change shape over time. People told him it would. They told him a year, told him 2 years, told him he was young enough to start again, told him life went on, told him Clara and William were in a better place, told him things that were meant as comfort and arrived as something else entirely. What he had discovered over the 3 years since was that the grief did not change shape so much as become familiar. It was still the same weight. He had simply learned how to carry it without showing the effort. He turned and went inside. He ate breakfast standing at the counter the same as every morning. 2 eggs cooked in the cast iron, a cold biscuit left from 2 nights before, a second cup of coffee that he drank too fast because he always did. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale at the eastern edge, a thin line of gray-white above the dark mountains. He could hear the cattle beginning to move in the far pasture. The water problem had started 3 weeks ago. The creek that ran along the northern boundary of his property was a thin but dependable thread of water that came down from the foothills through a narrow cut in the red rock and fed his stock tank and the series of irrigation channels he had dug himself in the first spring. Even in the dry years, it had run enough to keep the cattle through summer. This year, it had slowed in September, along with everything else which he had expected. What he had not expected was the way it continued to drop in October, past the point that drought alone could explain, down to a trickle so thin by the second week that the stock tank was barely refilling overnight. He had ridden north twice to follow the creek back toward its source. Both times he found the same thing at the point where the water crossed from the neighboring property onto his land, evidence of recent earthwork. Packed clay and stacked flat stone, not natural, not old, but placed deliberately and with care by someone who knew what they were doing and had taken the time to do it properly. Someone had been diverting the water upstream. Not all of it. Enough. He knew whose land lay to the north. Denton Shaw. Jasper had known Shaw for 11 years. They had arrived in Serrano Flats within a season of each other, both young men with more ambition than capital and a willingness to work in a place where the land rewarded work with something close to a living. They had helped each other string fence in the early years, shared tools and labor, during the hard seasons sat together on the porch of May Dunnigan's boarding house the evening Jasper's first calf was born, and passed a bottle of whiskey back and forth without saying much, which was the best kind of company there is. Shaw had come to Clara's burial. He had stood at the edge of the small gathered crowd with his hat in his hands and his face arranged into something that at the time Jasper had believed was genuine sorrow. Shaw's ambitions had grown larger than his original self somewhere in the years between then and now. He had doubled his acreage, then tripled it, buying up parcels when their owners gave up and left, which in that country happened with a regularity that kept the land prices low. He had taken on supply contracts with the railroad camps pushing west across the territory, which meant he needed more cattle, which meant he needed more land, which meant he needed more water. He had built a 2-story house with glass windows that reflected the sunset orange across his front yard in the evenings. He had hired men, then hired other men to manage them. He had become, in the decade since the boarding house porch and the shared bottle, a different species of man. He had made his first offer on Jasper's western acreage 14 months ago. It had been generous. The second offer 6 months later had been more generous still. The third and fourth had come closer together, the numbers climbing, the language of the conversations shifting from neighborly to something more precisely calibrated. Each time Jasper had said no. Each time Shaw had left wearing the expression of a man who was revising his approach rather than abandoning his objective. The morning Thomas arrived was the morning of the first hard frost. Thomas Lorne was 24, 14 years younger than his brother, built lighter and quicker with their mother's dark eyes and a particular talent for saying the thing that was most difficult to hear in the most direct way possible. He worked as a smith at the livery in town and came out to the ranch most weeks, usually arriving mid-morning, usually bringing something he claimed to have left over but had clearly bought on purpose. He was the only person in Jasper's life who treated him as though the grief were a fact to be acknowledged rather than a wound to be carefully avoided. He tied his horse at the post and came around to the east fence where Jasper was working, and he stood for a moment watching before he spoke. "Creek's worse," Thomas said. "Third section's almost nothing," Jasper said without looking up. Thomas pushed his hands into his coat pockets. He looked north toward where the creek ran. "Shaw came by the livery 3 days ago," Thomas said. "Stayed an hour. Talked to 4 different people." He paused. "He's not asking any more, Jasper. He's measuring." The wire was cold and stiff, and it fought him. He worked it slowly. "He came by here 2 weeks ago," Jasper said. "Same offer as before. 200 acres on the west side keep everything east of the draw. The graves are on the west side. He knows that." Thomas was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of dry grass and cold rock. "What happens if the water gets worse?" Thomas said. "Another month like this, you lose 20 head minimum. Lose the income, you can't make the spring payment on the equipment loan. You lose the equipment, you lose the ability to work the land. You lose the land anyway, Jasper. And then you're standing in an empty field with 2 stones and nothing holding you here at all." Jasper straightened and looked at his brother. Thomas looked back at him with the steadiness of someone who has decided that honesty, even at a cost, is a form of love. "I'm not telling you to sell," Thomas said. "I'm telling you that not deciding is a decision, and right now it's the worst one available." Jasper turned back to the fence. The silence between them had a particular texture, not hostile, but load-bearing, the kind of silence that holds things which cannot quite be said. "Rosa's father won't let me see her," Thomas said after a while. His voice had changed register, entirely gone quieter and younger. "He says I have no land, no future, nothing worth offering a man's daughter. He's not wrong about the land part." Jasper looked up then and looked at his brother properly for the first time that morning. He saw what was underneath the argument about the ranch. "I'm sorry about Rosa," Jasper said. "Yeah." Thomas looked at the frozen ground. "She's worth more than sorry." They worked together in silence for a while after that, Jasper on the fence and Thomas handing him wire and tools without being asked, the way brothers fall into shared labor without needing to arrange it. An hour passed. Thomas's horse stamped in the cold. When Thomas finally mounted and turned to ride back toward town, he stopped at the edge of the property and looked back at his brother standing in the field. "They're gone, Jasper," he said. Not unkindly, not gently either, just straight. "Clara and Will. They've been gone 3 years. You know that." He paused. "What you're holding on to out here is not them. It's the last version of yourself that knew how to be happy. And I don't know if that's better or worse, but I think you should know what you're actually doing." He turned and rode back toward Serrano Flats, and Jasper stood in the field and watched him go until the distance reduced him to nothing. The wind came up from the south and moved through the cottonwood at the end of the yard, pulling the last few leaves from the high branches in slow-turning spirals. One landed near Jasper's boot. Pale yellow, curled at the edges, already translucent with dying. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work, because that was the only answer he had to any of it. That evening after supper, he sat in his chair by the window in the dark room and looked at the mountains. Clara's chair sat at its angle 3 feet away, empty and permanent as the stones at the end of the yard. The moonlight came through the glass and lay in pale rectangles on the floor between the 2 chairs. He thought about what Thomas had said. He sat with it until the fire in the stove burned down to coals and the room went cold, and then he got up and banked the fire for the night and went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. When he finally did, he dreamed of the creek running full and cold and clear, the way it had in the first spring before any of it. He woke in the gray pre-dawn with the certain and inexplicable sense that something was approaching. Not dread, not hope either. Something in between the feeling of a weather change, the knowledge the body holds before the mind catches up. He was right about that. He simply did not yet know in what form it would arrive. Wednesday was market day in Serrano Flats. The town occupied a flat stretch of ground at the point where the stage road bent south toward the river, surrounded by the particular emptiness of high desert in October. It was not a prosperous town. It had the buildings that a town of its size required, and not many others, a general store that smelled of dried goods and kerosene, a livery stable where Thomas worked his trade 6 days a week, May Dunnigan's boarding house, which served the best coffee in the county and whose proprietor had an opinion on every subject and the good sense to keep most of them to herself, a small adobe church at the north end that was in a slow and dignified process of returning to the earth from which it had been made, and a saloon on the corner where the stage road turned that did reasonable business every day and exceptional business on Wednesdays. On market Wednesdays, the main street held something close to life for a few hours before it emptied again. Wagons lined the road. The smell of animals and dust and fry bread from the woman who set up her cart outside the general store mixed together in the cold air. Men in worn coats stood in clusters near the hitching rails, talking in the way that men talk in public, covering a small amount of actual conversation with a larger quantity of weather and cattle prices. Jasper arrived at 10:30, tied his horse in front of the general store, and went inside. He collected his supplies methodically: a spool of fence wire, 2 20-pound sacks of salt, a tin of coffee, a box of cartridges, a bottle of liniment for the old mare's front leg. He settled his account with the proprietor, a compact and efficient man named Burwell, who had learned early in their acquaintance that Jasper preferred transactions to conversations and had honored this preference ever since. Jasper carried his supplies outside and began loading the horse. He had the salt positioned in the left saddlebag and was working the wire spool under the flap when the street changed. It did not change suddenly or loudly. The change was a quieting, a gradual falling away of the ordinary Wednesday sounds: the conversations, the creak of a wagon being loaded 2 doors down, the complaint of a horse at the far hitching rail, the laughter from the saloon porch. These things did not stop all at once. They diminished the way sound diminishes when a person becomes aware of something that requires their full attention, the world narrowing to a single point. He straightened and looked up. She came from the western end of the street, and she came at a walk, and the walk was the first thing that set her apart from everything else moving in that street that morning. The horse moved at a pace that came entirely from her, steady and unhurried, as though there were no audience, no watching faces along the sidewalks and the porch railings, no particular significance to a Mescalero Apache woman riding alone into Serrano Flats on a cold Wednesday morning. She sat straight in the saddle, not with stiffness, but with the ease of someone entirely at home in their own body, which is a rarer thing than it sounds. Her hair was black and braided long down her left side, tied at the bottom with a strip of red leather that matched the cloth folded around the object she held in both hands against her chest. She wore a buckskin jacket over a dark blouse, and around her neck, against the buckskin, a string of turquoise beads caught the thin October sun and returned it as small, distinct points of blue light. Her face was composed, neither hard nor soft, but settled, the face of someone who has made a decision and passed through the anxiety of it to the other side. In her hands, held with deliberate and careful pressure, was a small box of hammered silver wrapped in cloth the color of dark blood. She did not look at the men on the saloon porch, who had gone quiet one by one as she passed. She did not look at the woman with the fry bread cart, who had stopped turning her pan and stood watching with an expression of pure attention. She did not look at the dog that had been investigating the base of the hitching post and now sat motionless with both ears forward, as dogs will sit when they sense something significant passing through their ordinary world. She looked at Jasper Lorne. Her eyes found him from half a block away and did not leave him as she covered the distance, and there was in that gaze nothing that asked for anything, no uncertainty, no apology for the attention she was drawing, no calculation about how he might receive what she was about to do. Only the direct and level regard of someone who has come a long way to stand in front of a specific person and is now doing precisely that. She guided the horse to where he stood and stopped. The street was nearly silent. Somewhere up the block a shutter swung loose against an adobe wall once, and the sound carried the length of the street in the quiet like a single note in an empty room. She swung down from the saddle with a single fluid motion, her moccasins meeting the packed dirt of the street without a sound. She was not tall. Standing on the ground before him, she was several inches shorter than he was, but she occupied her space with a completeness that made the difference in height irrelevant. She stepped forward the 3 steps that brought her directly in front of him and stopped. For a moment she simply looked at him. He looked back at her. The people on the saloon porch were watching. The woman with the fry bread cart was watching. Half a dozen men who had been loading wagons or attending to horses along the block had all found reasons to become very still. None of that showed in her face or his. She extended the silver box toward him, both hands the red cloth wrapped twice around it and folded at the top, not tied but tucked with care. "I am Sable Runningwater," she said. Her English was clear and precisely shaped, each word given its complete weight, the accent of someone who learned the language from teachers rather than from the street, who understood its grammar better perhaps than most of the people watching her use it. Daughter of gray stone of the Mescalero people. She did not stop there. "Accept this box," she said, "and be my husband." The silence on the street deepened into something almost physical. One of the men on the saloon porch made a sound that was half a laugh before someone beside him cut it short with a hand on his arm. A murmur passed through the small gathered audience like wind through dry grass, brief and involuntary. Jasper did not look toward the porch. He looked at the box she held toward him. The silver was worked with a repeating pattern of lines and angles, not decorative in the way of ornament, but the way of meaning, each element placed in relation to the others, with a purpose he could not read, but could recognize as purposeful. Then he looked at her face. She was not performing confidence. She was not performing anything. She was simply standing in front of him in the cold morning air of a street full of people, holding out a silver box and waiting with the patience of someone who understands that the important moments in a life do not arrive quickly and cannot be hurried. From the far end of the saloon porch, a figure detached itself and began moving toward them. Deputy Rourke. A sandy-haired man of 40 with the compact build and the particular walk of someone who has carried a badge long enough to let it do his thinking for him. His thumbs were hooked in his belt, and he was coming at the measured pace of official business. Jasper raised his right hand without looking at Rourke, open palm fingers together, a gesture that carried no aggression and no uncertainty. "Stop." Rourke stopped. He stood where he was, 12 feet away, surprise moving briefly across his features before he composed them back into official blankness. Jasper looked back at Sable Running Water. He had lived in Serrano Flats for 5 years. In that time he had conducted his life in the narrowest possible channel, the ranch and the supply runs, and the occasional conversation with Thomas, and the wordless weekly exchange with Burwell at the general store. He had not been unkind to people. He had simply absented himself from the portions of life that required an investment he no longer had to make. It had seemed for 3 years like the only sustainable arrangement. Looking at this woman now, he was aware of something shifting in that arrangement. Not dramatically, not with any feeling he could have named clearly in that moment, but something. Whatever she wanted, whatever the silver box contained, whatever her reason for riding into this particular town on this particular Wednesday morning, she had come alone across country that did not favor solitary travelers regardless of their competence. And she was standing in front of a street full of people who were looking at her the way people look at things outside their experience, and she had not adjusted a single thing about herself to accommodate any of it. That was worth something. He did not yet know what. "Come with me," he said. He untied his horse from the hitching post and led it by the reins. She fell into step beside him at once. No hesitation, leading her own horse with the loose ease of someone who has spent most of her life in the company of horses. They walked together toward the western end of the street, away from the saloon, away from the general store, away from the gathered watching faces, and the sounds of the market morning resumed slowly behind them as they went, filling the space they vacated with the ordinary noise of the ordinary world. Neither of them spoke as they walked. They passed the last building on the western end of the street, the old harness shop that had been empty for 2 years, its wooden sign faded beyond reading. The road opened out ahead of them into the open country, the pale grass and the red rock and the wide pale sky. They continued for a quarter mile until the sounds of the town fell away behind them, and then Jasper led them off the road toward a low shelf of red sandstone that jutted from the hillside above the road, providing a flat surface and a view of the valley below, and he tied both horses to a scrub oak and turned to face her. She was already looking at him. She held the silver box against her chest, still in both hands, the red cloth dark against the buckskin of her jacket. In the open country, away from the town, she seemed neither diminished nor enlarged. In the open country, away from the town, without an audience and without the weight of the street's attention, she carried the same quality she had carried into Serrano Flats, a completeness of presence that required nothing from its surroundings to remain intact. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of dry earth and distant rain that the clouds on the northern horizon might or might not deliver. "Before you explain," Jasper said, "Tell me one thing." She waited. "There are 20 ranchers in this county with more land than I have. Younger men, men without trouble on their property." He paused. "Why me?" She was quiet for a moment, not searching for the answer but measuring how much of it to give him now and how much to hold for when he had heard enough of the rest to understand it properly. 3 years ago," she said, "a representative from a land company in Santa Fe came to our camp. He carried papers that gave him the right, he said, to purchase the water rights to the creek that runs through our territory. He had already visited the ranchers in this county. 11 of the 12 had agreed to sell him their sections upstream from ours." She held his eyes. "One had not," she said. "When my father sent someone to find out why the man said the water had been there before him and would be there after him and was not his to sell." She paused. "That same man had purchased the parcel east of our land the previous spring. When my father's messenger asked why he had not tried to buy the section bordering it, which was ours and which was better land, the man said, 'It is not mine to buy.'" Jasper said nothing. "My father remembered that," she said. "He remembered it for 3 years." The wind moved through the brush on the hillside below them. A pair of ravens crossed the sky above the red cliff to the south, their calls carrying down the distance. "Your father is Greystone," Jasper said. "Yes." "He's been ill." "He is dying," she said. The flatness in her voice was not the flatness of someone who did not feel it. It was the flatness of someone who had already done the work of feeling it and come out the other side into something like acceptance, which is one of the harder things a person can do. "I'm sorry," Jasper said. She accepted this with a small nod. "He sent me here because the water is being taken from our land as it is being taken from yours. He sent me here because he is no longer strong enough to negotiate with the men who are taking it. He sent me here because the law in this territory does not hear the Mescalero people when they speak through their own voices." She looked at him steadily. "He needs someone who can stand between his people and what is coming," she said. "Not a hired man, not a lawyer from Santa Fe who will take his fee regardless of the outcome. Someone who has a reason to fight for the same ground." "And the box," Jasper said. "The offer is real," she said. "Not a negotiation, not a strategy. The things in this box represent a real intention made in the presence of my father and the elders of my people. If you accept it knowing what it is." She said all of this without any of the softening or hedging that people use when they are not sure of what they are saying. She said it the way a person states a fact of geography. "Here is the mountain, here is the river, here is what I am offering, and here is what it means." Jasper looked at the box and then looked out across the valley below them. He could see the roof of his own barn from here, a small dark square against the pale hillside, and at this distance it looked very small and very alone against the enormity of the land around it. The same creek that was drying up on his northern boundary was drying up on theirs. He had been sitting at his kitchen table every morning thinking about his problem, unable to see past the fences of his own property, while the same problem wore a different face 2 miles to the north and had been wearing it 2 months longer. He thought about what Thomas had said the morning before, about what he was actually holding on to and what it was costing him. He looked at the woman standing before him in the cold October wind, holding a silver box in both hands, who had ridden in alone, who had stood in a street full of watching strangers, and said what she came to say without flinching or softening a syllable of it, and who was looking at him now with the patient and direct regard of someone who has asked a serious question and is waiting for a serious answer. "I cannot answer you today," he said. "I know," she said. "But I will listen," he said, "if you will tell me what I need to know." Something shifted in her expression, very small, like the first movement of water when a stone is dropped into a still pool, the disturbance just reaching the surface. "That is enough," she said. She did not lower the box. She held it still between them in the cold, bright air above the valley, above the pale grass, and the red rock and the dark, winding line of the dying creek below. They stood together for a moment without speaking. Two people who had each carried something heavy for a long time and had not yet put it down, looking at the same wide and difficult land, the same sky, the same distant mountains that had been there before either of them arrived and would be there long after both of them were gone. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one. And in Serrano Flats, at the far end of the main street outside the saloon where the market morning had returned to its ordinary noise, Denton Shaw stood at the corner with his coat collar turned up against the wind. He had arrived in town an hour ago. He had watched from the doorway of the empty harness shop. He had watched the Apache woman ride in. He had watched Jasper raise his hand to stop Rourke. He had watched them walk away together west out of town. He stood at the corner for a while after they disappeared, watching the empty end of the street with the expression of a man who has just discovered that a situation he believed he understood has more dimensions than he accounted for and who is deciding how to adjust. Then he turned to Rourke, who had come up beside him without being summoned. "The woman," Shaw said. His voice was unhurried, almost pleasant, the voice of a man accustomed to having information brought to him rather than having to pursue it. "Find out who she is. Find out what she wants from Lorne." Rourke nodded. Shaw looked once more at the empty western end of the street, at the point where the road bent away into the open country and was swallowed by the pale October morning. "Don't do anything," he said. "Not yet. Just find out." He put his hands in his pockets and walked back toward where his horse was tied. The men on the saloon porch watched him go with the careful peripheral attention of people employed by a man they understand well enough to be cautious around. The market morning moved on around all of it. Wagons were loaded, accounts were settled, the ordinary world continued in its ordinary way. But something had changed in it, something small and irreversible, the way a crack in river ice is small until it is not had opened in the ordinary Wednesday morning of Serrano Flats, New Mexico, in the fall of 1881. It had opened in the space between a man standing at a saddlebag and a woman riding toward him from the west with a silver box held against her chest, and it would not close again. Out on the hillside above the valley road, two horses stood patient and still at a scrub oak. Below them, the pale grass ran all the way to the mountains. The sky was enormous and cold and entirely blue, and two people stood on the red sandstone shelf above the road and looked at the same land from the same place, and did not yet know what they were building, only that they had begun. The sandstone shelf above the valley road caught the afternoon sun and held it the way stone holds everything, without preference, without warmth of its own, simply receiving what the sky offered and giving nothing back. Jasper sat on the flat rock with one knee drawn up and his hat resting on his thigh, and Sable sat 3 feet away with the silver box in her lap and her hands folded over it, and for a while neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. That surprised him. He had grown accustomed over 3 years to silences that had weight in them, the kind that pressed against the interior of a room or a conversation and had to be endured rather than inhabited. This silence was different. It had the quality of open ground of land before anything was built on it, the kind of quiet that does not demand to be filled. He noticed that she did not fidget. Most people, when they were waiting and uncertain of their reception, found small things to do with their hands. She simply sat with her hands over the box and looked at the valley below them with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who has learned that looking carefully at a thing is not the same as being impatient with it. Below them, the valley opened wide and pale. The creek bed was visible from up here, a dark, irregular line through the dry grass, narrower than it should have been. The water in it reduced to something that caught the light only in the shallower stretches where the rock broke the surface. It ran north to south across his property line and continued beyond it. And from up here you could see the whole length of it, could see where it entered his land and where it had come from. And there was something clarifying about the elevation. The way things you could not see from the ground became obvious when you rose above them. He had been looking at that creek from ground level for 3 weeks. He looked at it now from above and understood that he had only ever seen one part of a longer problem. "Tell me about your father," he said. Sable did not answer immediately. She looked out over the valley the way he was looking, her dark eyes moving along the line of the creek from north to south. "He is a careful man," she said at last. "Not cautious, careful." There is a difference. She paused. Cautious men do not act until they are certain. My father acts when he understands. He is rarely wrong about what he understands. And he understands me, Jasper said. It was not quite a question. He understands what you did 3 years ago, she said, and what you did not do. He spent 2 years thinking about the difference. Jasper was quiet. The wind moved through the scrub oak where the horses stood pulling at the dry leaves, and the horses shifted and were still again. "The box," he said. Sable lifted it from her lap and held it out between them. She did not open it yet. She held it as she had held it riding into town with both hands, the red cloth dark and careful against her fingers. "Before I open it," she said, "I want to tell you what it means. Not what the things inside are, what they mean. Because if you accept them knowing what they mean, and you choose later to set them aside, that is one thing. But if you accept them not knowing, that is something else, and my father would not want that." "All right," Jasper said. "The box itself was made by my father's mother," she said. "She made it for her own marriage 40 years ago. She gave it to my father to give to my mother. My mother died when I was 5. My father has kept the box since then." She paused. "He chose to give it to me for this. That is not a small thing." Jasper said nothing. He looked at the box and thought about a man keeping an object for 22 years, keeping it through a wife's death and a daughter growing up, and all the seasons that followed, and then deciding that this was the moment and this was the person. Sable unfolded the red cloth and opened the box. Inside, against a lining of dark cloth, 3 things rested. A ring of polished turquoise set in silver, the stone a deep and particular blue that was not quite the color of the sky or the color of water, but something between them, something that seemed to belong to a different element altogether. Beside it, a cord of braided leather, 3 strands twisted together the color of old wood, and beside that a small square of cloth the size of a man's palm, painted with symbols in deep blue and dark red, the figures small and precise and clearly the work of careful hands. "The ring is unity," she said. 2 people joined under one sky. The cord is strength. The 3 strands are the man, the woman, and the life between them. If one strand weakens, the others hold it. She touched the painted cloth without lifting it. "This was made by my father. The symbols carry his blessing and the blessing of the council. It means the joining is recognized by the people." She looked up at him. "And there is one more thing," she said. She reached beneath the 3 objects and lifted a folded piece of paper. Not old paper, not ceremonial. A plain piece of writing paper folded once. She held it out to him. He took it and unfolded it. It was a map drawn in pencil with care and accuracy, showing the creek from its source in the foothills all the way down through the Mescalero territory and across the northern boundary of his property and beyond. Someone had marked the creek's path in detail, noting the rock formations and the bends and the points where it widened. And in 3 places on the map in a different hand, someone had marked crosses and written beside them in small, precise letters, diversion point, recent work, estimated date. The most recent mark was dated 4 days ago. "Your people surveyed this," Jasper said. "My father has had men watching the creek for 2 months," she said, "since the first diversion. He knew you would need evidence that could stand before a land court. He had them document everything they found." Jasper looked at the map for a long time. He looked at the 3 diversion points marked and dated. He looked at the shape of the problem laid out in pencil on a single sheet of paper, the whole thing visible at once, in a way it had never been when he was standing in the middle of it. He folded the map carefully and held it. "This is why he sent you," Jasper said. "Not just for the marriage. He needs someone who can take this to the land court, a white man who owns the downstream property. His word would carry weight mine alone would not." "Yes," she said. "And the marriage," he said, "that is not just a strategy." She looked at him with the same level regard she had turned on him in the street, the gaze that did not ask anything of him, but received everything he offered with complete attention. "No," she said, It is not just a strategy. My father does not use his mother's box for strategies." The wind came up from the valley below and moved between them cold and clean, carrying the smell of the creek and the dry grass and the distant suggestion of rain from the clouds building over the northern mountains. Jasper looked at the ring in the open box. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "I had a wife," he said. He said it the way you say a thing you have not said aloud in a long time, carefully, as if testing whether the words still held their original weight. They did. "Her name was Clara. We had a son. His name was William. They died 3 years ago." Sable said nothing. She did not say she was sorry. She did not look away. She received the information the way she received everything, with full attention and without the performance of sympathy that people use to fill the space when they do not know what to do with another person's grief. "I mention it," Jasper said, "because you should know it is there. It doesn't go away. I have learned that much." "I know," Sable said quietly. Something in the way she said it made him look up. "I was to be married 2 years ago," she said. "His name was Running Fox. He was killed in a confrontation with soldiers near the eastern boundary of our territory. They said he was armed. He was not armed." She paused. "I know what it is to carry something that does not go away." They sat with that for a while, the two losses present between them, not as weights on the conversation, but as facts about who they each were. The way the mountains to the north were facts about the landscape simply there, part of the shape of everything. There was a quality to that particular kind of shared silence that Jasper had not encountered before. The people in Serrano Flats who knew about Clara and William treated the subject like a hot coal, approaching it carefully, if at all using soft language and indirect gestures, handling his grief as if the wrong word might cause an irreversible damage. He had come to understand that their care was genuine, and their discomfort was genuine too, and he did not blame them for it. But it had the effect over time of making him feel that what he carried was something frightening, something that had to be contained rather than simply acknowledged. Sable had not flinched. She had not offered softness or careful language. She had received the information and then offered her own in the same register, matter-of-fact and complete, and somewhere in that exchange something shifted slightly in the weight of what he had been carrying. Not lighter, just differently arranged. "I can't answer you today," Jasper said again. He said it differently this time, not as a refusal, but as the truth of where he was. "I know," she said again. "But this," he said, and lifted the map. "This I can do something about, if you're willing to work with me on it." "That is why I came," she said. "No," he said. "That is part of why you came. The other part, the box and what's in it, I need time for that." She looked at him for a moment. Then she closed the box and folded the red cloth back around it with the same careful hands that had held it all the way from the Mescalero camp to the main street of Serrano Flats and out here to this sandstone shelf above the valley. "Then I will wait," she said. "But not forever. My father does not have forever." "I understand that," Jasper said. She tucked the box back inside her jacket against her side, close to her body. And the ease with which she did it, the naturalness of the gesture, as if the box had always had that place, and she had always been its keeper, struck him in a way he did not examine too closely and set aside for later. He stood and offered his hand to help her up from the rock. She took it without hesitation, her grip firm and brief, and they walked back to the horses in the thin October light with the map in his hand and the unanswered question between them, like a third presence patient and without urgency waiting for its time. They came to an arrangement that was practical before it was anything else. Sable would stay at May Dunnigan's boarding house in Serrano Flats for the time being. May, who had seen enough of life to be unsurprised by most of it, received her arrival with the matter-of-fact efficiency she applied to all new guests, and assigned her the corner room on the second floor without commentary. Whatever she thought about the situation, she kept it filed under her own counsel, which was where she kept most of her opinions about most things. Jasper came to town 3 days after the conversation on the sandstone shelf and found Sable at the table in the front room of the boarding house, writing in a small notebook with careful, close handwriting. She looked up when he came in and closed the notebook without marking her place, which meant either she remembered everything or she did not plan to return to it. He sat down across from her and put the map on the table between them. "I rode the creek," he said, "all the way to the first diversion point. Your people marked it right. There's packed clay across the natural channel, and the water's been redirected into a secondary cut that runs north onto Shaw's property. It's not visible from the road, and it's not on any survey map." "Can it be proved that it was done deliberately?" she asked. "The clay was cut and shaped," he said. "That doesn't happen in nature. And I found boot prints in the soft ground on the downstream side. Several men, several visits. Someone maintained it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. "The second diversion point is on our land," she said. "My father's men found it 6 weeks ago, the same kind of work. But on our land there is no one to complain to. The Territorial Land Office does not take reports from the Mescalero." "They'll take a report from me," Jasper said. She looked up at him. "About my land," he said. "About the diversion on my northern boundary, with the map your father had made as supporting evidence. I file a complaint with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. It goes on record. Shaw can't pretend it didn't happen." He paused. "But I want to know something first." "What? Is this the only play your father has? Or is there more?" She held his eyes steadily. "My father does not send all his horses at the fence at once," she said. "There is more, but it depends on what you are willing to do." "Tell me what I'm deciding between," he said. She leaned forward slightly. "The land office complaint establishes the diversion. It slows Shaw. But slowing is not stopping. Shaw has money, and he has time, and he has the patience of a man who has never been denied anything for very long." She paused. "To stop him, you need to make his position costly enough that the railroad company loses confidence in him. If the railroad company loses confidence, they withdraw the contract. Without the contract, Shaw has no reason to fight. How do you make his position costly?" "The water rights are held in common along that creek under a territorial agreement from 1863, she said. "An agreement that was made when there were only 3 ranchers in this valley, and my father's people were still acknowledged as having claim to the upper reaches. That agreement was never formally dissolved. It still exists, but it requires someone with standing in the territorial court to bring it forward." Jasper looked at the map again. Then he looked at her. "Your father had this planned before he sent you," he said. "Yes," she said. "He knew about the 1863 agreement. He has known about it for 20 years. Jasper was quiet for a moment. Outside the window of the boarding house, the main street of Serrano Flats went about its mid-morning business, unaware that a woman from the Mescalero camp and a rancher from the south end of the valley were sitting at a table in May Dunnigan's front room, working out the architecture of something that could change the shape of the land for the next 50 years. "Your father is a careful man," Jasper said. "Yes," Sable said. And for the first time since she had ridden into Serrano Flats on a cold Wednesday morning, the corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile, something smaller than that and more precise. The expression of someone who has seen the person across from them finally catch up to where she already was. Jasper looked at that expression for a moment. Then he looked back down at the map. "All right," he said. "Tell me the rest." Thomas Lorne found out about the arrangement, the way Thomas found out about most things in that town, which was by being in the livery, when 2 of Shaw's hands came in to have their horses shod and talked freely about things they should have kept quiet, apparently under the impression that a man working a bellows and a hammer was too occupied to listen. What they said was not much, but it was enough. Shaw knew about the Apache woman at May's boarding house. Shaw knew she had been to see Jasper. Shaw knew or believed he knew that some kind of proposal had been made, though the exact nature of it appeared not yet to have reached him in its full dimensions. What Shaw had done with this knowledge was send Rourke to the land office in the county seat to pull whatever records existed on the creek water rights, which told Thomas that Shaw was not panicking, but was moving, which was in some ways worse than panic, because it was methodical. Thomas closed the livery at noon and rode out to the ranch. Jasper was in the south pasture when Thomas arrived, moving the cattle away from the dry section of the tank toward the small seep on the eastern boundary that was still producing a thin flow. He saw his brother coming and left the cattle to sort themselves and met him at the fence. Thomas told him what he had heard. Jasper listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that Thomas, when he had something important to say, said it most efficiently when not interrupted, the words coming in the order he had arranged them on the ride out, losing their structure if he was made to stop and restart. When Thomas finished, the two of them stood at the fence for a moment in the thin afternoon light, the cattle moving slowly behind Jasper and the horses standing patient at the posts behind Thomas, and the creek visible in the middle distance, its diminished trickle catching the sun in brief flickers between the rocks. "He's already looking at the water rights records," Thomas said. "If he finds the 1863 agreement before you file on it, he'll find a way to complicate it. He has a lawyer in Santa Fe who has made a career out of complicating things." "I know," Jasper said. "You need to file first." "I know that too." Thomas looked at him for a moment. "How much has she told you?" "Enough." Thomas pushed his hat back on his head and looked out across the pasture at the cattle moving slowly toward the eastern seep. "She's still at May's?" "Yes." "Have you given her an answer yet?" Jasper did not respond immediately. He looked at the cattle, and then at the line of the mountains, and then at the fence post he was leaning on, and Thomas watched him the way you watch a man who is carrying something heavy and deciding where to put it down. "Not yet," Jasper said. Thomas nodded slowly. "Her father's dying, Jasper." "I know. And this water thing is not going to wait long. Shaw is already moving." "I know that too." "Then what are you waiting for?" Thomas said. Not unkindly. In the direct way he always spoke to his brother, the way he had spoken to him since they were boys, without the buffer of patience that other people used around Jasper since Clara and William died. Jasper turned and looked at him. "I'm waiting to be sure I'm deciding for the right reasons," he said. "Not because I'm in a corner, not because it solves a problem, but because it's right." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's fair." He said it the way a man says something he means and does not need to elaborate on. They walked back to the house together, and Thomas stayed for the midday meal, and they ate without talking much, which was a comfortable silence. This time the silence of two people who have said what needed saying and do not need to fill the rest with words. After Thomas left, Jasper sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the map in front of him and the afternoon light moving across the floor. He thought about what Thomas had said, about deciding for the right reasons. He turned that over in his mind the way you turn a tool in your hand before you use it, examining it from each angle to be sure it will do what you need it to do. Clara had been gone 3 years. William had been gone 3 years. He had not moved the blue coffee cup or the chair by the window, and he had not let anyone move them for him, and he had told himself this was respect, and he had believed it for a long time, and he was less certain of it now. Thomas had said it plainly. He was holding on to the last version of himself that knew how to be happy, holding on to it so tightly that there was no room in his hands for anything new. He looked at the map. He looked at the 3 diversion points marked in careful pencil, documented by men who had gone out at their chief's direction and walked the length of a dying creek in order to build a case that their chief could then place in the hands of a woman and send her 60 miles to lay before a man who did not know her. Greystone had known about the 1863 agreement for 20 years. He had held it in reserve through all those years, watching, waiting, understanding that the time to use it would come, and that using it at the wrong moment would be worse than not using it at all. He had watched a rancher refuse to buy water rights that were not his to buy. He had watched that same rancher refuse to purchase the adjacent land. He had spent 2 years deciding what that meant about the man's character before he sent his daughter to that man's town with his mother's silver box. Careful was the right word. Jasper folded the map and put it inside his coat. He went to the barn and saddled the gray mare, the one whose front leg needed the liniment he had bought at Burwell's. He rode her easy, letting her set her own pace on the south road toward town, and arrived at May Dunnigan's boarding house in the late afternoon when the light was coming low and orange from the west and laying long shadows across the main street. May was on the porch with her mending when he rode up. "She's in the back," May said without looking up from her work. "At the table in the kitchen. Been writing all afternoon." She paused. "You want coffee?" "Please," Jasper said. He tied the mare and went inside. Sable was at the kitchen table as May had said, the small notebook open in front of her, her pen moving in the careful, close script he had seen before. She looked up when he came in and this time did not close the notebook, only set the pen down beside it. He sat across from her. May brought 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and went back to her porch without a word, which was her particular talent, the ability to be present and absent in the same motion. Jasper put his hands around the cup and looked at Sable. "Shaw is already pulling the water rights records at the county seat," he said. "If he finds the 1863 agreement and engages his lawyer before I file, it becomes complicated. Complicated means slow. Slow means the railroad contract goes through and the land changes hands before any court can say otherwise." Sable said nothing. She was listening. "I'm going to Santa Fe," he said. "I'll file the complaint with the Territorial Land Office and I'll ask to have the 1863 agreement brought forward as part of the record. It needs to be on file before Shaw's lawyer can move to complicate it." "When will you go?" she said. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "I need a day to prepare the documents." She nodded. "I will write a letter for you to carry, from my father. It establishes the Mescalero claim to the upper reaches of the creek under the original agreement, in my father's own hand, witnessed by 2 council members." She paused. "The territorial court may not accept it directly, but it will be part of the record, and records have a way of surviving long after the men who made them." Jasper picked up his coffee and drank. It was strong and good, and May made it the way not many people did, without apology. "There is something else," Sable said. He looked at her. "Shaw will know you have gone to Santa Fe. He will know why, and while you are gone, he may act." She said it plainly without dramatizing it. "He has been patient because he believed he was winning by patience. When he finds out patience is no longer working, he will become something else." "What kind of something else?" "A man who has committed himself too far to stop," she said. "He has a contract deadline with the railroad. He has made commitments he cannot walk back from without losing more than just this particular land. When he understands that, he will act quickly, and he will not be careful about it." Jasper looked at her. "What are you telling me to do?" "I am telling you what is coming," she said. "Not telling you what to do. What you do is your decision." He set down the cup. Outside the kitchen window the light had gone copper and low, and the main street was emptying of its afternoon traffic, the wagons heading home to the outlying ranches and farms, the town settling into its evening quiet. Down the block the saloon was beginning its nightly trade, the lamps lit in the window, the sound of voices carrying on the still air. He watched the light change in the window. There was something about sitting in a kitchen with someone that was different from all other kinds of sitting together. Kitchens were not performative spaces. They were where the practical business of living happened, the fire and the food and the daily necessities, and a person in someone's kitchen was closer to who they actually were than a person in a parlor or on a porch. He thought about the kitchen in his own house, the one coffee cup on the second shelf, the one chair that never moved. He thought about whether those things would always be there, and whether their being there was honor or whether it was something else. "My father knows that Shaw has been blocking the water on our land for 2 months," Sable said more quietly now. "He has said nothing. He has been waiting for me to come back with your answer before he decides how to proceed. If I return without an answer, he will act on his own, and his actions will be less careful than mine." Jasper looked at her for a long moment. "Is that a warning?" he said. "It is a fact," she said. He picked up the coffee cup again, found it empty, and set it down. "I have a question," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly." "I have answered every question you have asked honestly," she said. "I know," he said. "This one is different." He paused. "If your father were not dying, if the water were not being blocked and there were no land case and no railroad deadline, if none of those things were happening, would you still have come?" The kitchen was very quiet. The sounds from the street outside seemed very far away. Sable looked at him across the table. She looked at him the way she had looked at him from the moment she had ridden into this town, with the complete and level attention that was her way of being present to things, and she did not answer immediately. "I do not know," she said at last. It was not the answer he had expected. He had expected either yes or no, and yes would have been one thing, and no would have been another. But "I do not know" was a third thing entirely more honest than either of the others, and more unsettling. "My father sent me," she said. "That is true. The reasons were real. The land, the water, his illness, all real." She paused. "But I chose to come. No one carried me. I rode in on my own horse, and I said my own words, and I carried this box, because I chose to carry it." She touched the outside of her jacket where the box rested against her side. "Whether I would have found my way here without the reasons I cannot tell you. I only know that I am here with them." Jasper sat with that. Outside the sun finished its descent, and the copper light left the kitchen window, and the room went the gray-blue color of early dusk. "I'll need that letter from your father before I leave for Santa Fe," he said. "I will have it written by tomorrow morning," she said. He stood reaching for his hat. "Sable," he said. She looked up. "When I come back from Santa Fe," he said, "I'll give you an answer." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded once with the gravity of someone accepting a promise that they understand the weight of. He put on his hat and walked back through May's front room and out onto the porch. May was still there with her mending, or perhaps still there again with it. The sky above the street was the color of deep water, the first stars beginning to show in the east. "She's a good woman," May said without looking up. Jasper stopped on the step. "You don't know her," he said. "I've known her 3 days," May said. 3 days is enough when you're paying attention." She bit off a thread. "You have been alone too long, Jasper Lorne. A man can be alone so long he forgets it was a choice." He stood on the step for a moment longer. He thought about saying something in response to that. He could not find anything that would improve on it or refute it, and so he said nothing. He went to his horse and untied her and mounted and rode back toward the ranch in the dark with the map in his coat, and May's words following him out of town the way honest things do, refusing to stay where you left them. The road home ran north along the valley floor, and the stars came out fully above him as he rode the enormous New Mexico sky, doing what it always did when a man was under it alone at night, which was make everything seem at once very small and very clear. The cattle problem was a problem with a possible solution. The water rights were a problem with a possible solution. Shaw was a problem with a possible solution. The other thing, the harder thing, the question he had asked Sable and the answer she had given him, and the 3 years of blue coffee cups and unmoved chairs, that was a problem of a different kind. Not a problem that could be solved with documents or with a ride to Santa Fe. A problem that could only be resolved by a decision, and the decision could only be made by him, and it could not be made out of practicality or gratitude or the pressure of a dying man's timeline. It had to be made because it was right. He rode the rest of the way home thinking about that. When he reached the ranch and unsaddled the mare and put her in the barn and walked across the yard to the house, he stopped at the foot of the cottonwood and stood for a moment in the dark beside the 2 flat stones. He did not say anything. He rarely did out here. He just stood the way he always stood, present to what was here and what was not. The wind moved the cottonwood branches above him, and the dry leaves that remained whispered against each other in the dark. He went inside. He did not light the lamp. He sat in his chair by the window and looked out at the dark yard and the dark mountains beyond it, and Clara's chair was 3 feet away in its familiar angle, and for the first time in 3 years he did not find the sight of it comforting. He found it simply what it was, an empty chair. He sat with that new understanding for a long time. Then he went to bed, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, he slept straight through until morning. Behind him, in the main street of Serrano Flats, Denton Shaw's man Rourke stood in the shadow of the building across from May Dunnigan's boarding house, noting the time that Jasper Lorne had spent inside it. When Jasper rode north out of town, Rourke waited until the sound of the horse had faded completely before he walked to the saloon and sent a message to Shaw's house by the boy who ran errands for the barman. The message was brief. It said that Lorne and the Apache woman had been together for more than an hour, and that Lorne had left riding north with something in his coat. Shaw received the message at his supper table. He read it and folded it and put it in his pocket and continued eating. His face did not change, but his wife, who had been married to him for 16 years and knew the particular quality of his stillnesses, watched him from across the table and said nothing and thought a great deal. And the night settled over Serrano Flats, New Mexico, in the fall of 1881, cold and clear, and full of stars that had been burning above that country long before any of the people below them had arrived to conduct their small and serious business in the dust. Jasper left for Santa Fe on a Thursday morning before the sun had cleared the mountains. He rode light with 2 days of food in the saddlebag and the documents inside his coat where they would stay dry if the weather turned. He had spent the previous day writing the complaint in the careful, plain language that legal documents required, setting out the facts of the diversion without embellishment, letting the map do the work that argument could not. Sable's letter from Greystone was folded inside the same envelope written in the chief's hand in both English and in the script of his own language, witnessed and marked by 2 council members whose names Jasper did not know, but whose marks at the bottom of the page were deliberate and unhurried and carried the weight of people who understood exactly what they were signing. He had read the letter twice before he sealed the envelope. Greystone wrote in English that was formal and precise, the English of a man who had learned it as a second tongue in adulthood and used it only when necessary, and therefore used it exactly. He wrote about the creek and the 1863 agreement and the Mescalero claim to the upper reaches with the measured clarity of a man who had been composing this letter in his mind for 2 decades and needed no draft. At the end, in a paragraph that Jasper had not expected and that stayed with him through the 2-day ride to Santa Fe and back, Greystone had written, "My daughter does not do things she does not choose to do. She came to you because I asked her to come. She carried the box because she chose to carry it. A man who cannot see the difference between those 2 things is not the man I believe you to be. I trust my daughter's judgment in this as I have trusted it in everything. She has not yet been wrong about a person of consequence." Jasper had folded the letter back into the envelope and ridden north into the dark with those words sitting somewhere below his breastbone where they stayed. The Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe occupied a low adobe building on the north side of the plaza, staffed by 2 clerks who handled the endless paperwork of a territory in the process of becoming something more formal than it had been. The senior clerk, a meticulous man named Aldridge with ink-stained fingers, and the careful manner of someone who understood that documents outlasted everything else, received Jasper's complaint with the professional attention it deserved. He read the map. He read the complaint. He looked up over the rim of his spectacles and asked 3 clarifying questions, all of them precise, none of them hostile. When Jasper mentioned the 1863 agreement, Aldridge was quiet for a moment. Then he set down the papers, turned to the shelf behind him, and retrieved a ledger of a particular dark green color that had the look of something rarely consulted. He found the entry in 4 minutes. He read it. He read it again. He set the ledger open on the desk between them and turned it so that Jasper could see. The agreement was exactly as Greystone had described it. Water rights along the entire length of the creek, held in common by all parties, with acknowledged access to the watershed, including the Mescalero Band of the Upper Valley. The language was plain and its meaning was plain, and it had never been dissolved or superseded because no one had ever thought to dissolve it, which meant it was still in effect, which meant that anyone diverting that water without the consent of all parties was in direct violation of a territorial agreement that predated most of the current ranching operations in the valley by 18 years. Aldridge stamped the complaint, entered it in the log, and made a copy for the territorial file. He accepted Greystone's letter as supporting documentation and entered it under the same case number. He told Jasper that the complaint would be reviewed at the land court's next sitting 6 weeks out, and that in the meantime a formal notice of the existing agreement would be sent to all affected parties, including Denton Shaw. This would have the effect of making any further interference with the creek a matter of documented contempt rather than simple dispute. Jasper rode home with the case number written on a piece of paper in his coat pocket, and the feeling that something that had been falling had finally found a surface to rest on. He arrived back at the ranch on a Saturday evening with the horses tired and the light already going in the west. He unsaddled and fed and watered the animals and went inside and built up the fire and ate cold biscuit and dried beef and sat at the kitchen table in the good tiredness of a man who has done what he set out to do. He looked at the blue coffee cup on the second shelf. He looked at it for a long time. Then he stood up, took it down from the shelf, washed it carefully at the basin, and set it with the other cups. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. He went to bed. He was asleep by 8 o'clock, and he slept without dreaming until the dog woke him at 2 in the morning. He did not keep a dog. The animal was a stray that had been appearing at the edge of the property for the past month, thin and cautious, which he had been feeding from a distance without encouraging it to stay, which meant it had stayed anyway. It slept under the porch, and it did not bark at ordinary things, and when it barked now the sound was sharp and directional and aimed at the north end of the property. Jasper was out of bed and at the window in the same motion without light, the way he had learned to move in the years when moving quietly had mattered. He saw the glow before he understood what it was. The north end of the barn was on fire. Not fully yet. The fire was in the hay storage against the outside north wall, and it had not reached the inside where the horses were, but the wall was dry timber, and the October air was dry, and the wind was from the north, and it would reach the inside in minutes if it was not stopped. He pulled on his boots and his coat, and took the rifle from beside the door and went out. He went to the horses first. Both animals were awake and frightened, the whites of their eyes showing their hooves loud against the stall boards. He got them out one at a time, leading them fast to the far pasture and releasing them to run, and by the time he had the second horse clear, the fire had found the inside of the north wall, and the smell of burning hay was thick in the cold night air. He could not fight the fire alone. He knew this in the same instant he knew that whoever had set it had likely not gone far. He went to the shadows on the east side of the house and stood there with his back to the wall and the rifle across his chest, and waited. He did not wait long. 3 men came around the south end of the barn. They were not moving quietly. They had been watching the fire, and they were confident in the way men are confident when they believe they have already won, which is precisely when they are most vulnerable to being wrong. 2 of them carried torches. The third in front was Rourke. They stopped when they saw him. The firelight from the burning north wall lit the yard in unsteady orange, and the shadows moved with it, and Jasper stood in the one place the shadows stayed fixed against the east wall of the house, and he had the rifle up and the sight on Rourke before any of them fully understood where he was. "Put them down," Jasper said. His voice was even, not loud, the voice of a man who does not need volume to be heard. The 2 men with torches looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at Jasper. The calculation in his face was visible even in the firelight, the weighing of a rifle against a career, and a career won. He dropped the torch. The other 2 followed. "Go," Jasper said. They went, back around the south end of the barn and down the road toward town. He listened to their horses starting up in the distance and waited until the sound faded completely, and then he went to the water barrel beside the barn and spent the next 2 hours fighting the fire on the north wall with bucket after bucket until the wood was black and smoking and the fire was out, and the barn stood damaged, but standing the horses safe in the far pasture, watching from a distance with the patient incomprehension of animals observing the consequences of human decisions. He sat on the ground against the barn wall. When it was done, his coat soaked through his arms, burning from the work, the smell of wet ash heavy in the cold air. The stars were still out above him, undisturbed by all of it. He sat there until the sky began to gray in the east. Then he saddled one of the horses and rode to town. He went to May's first. It was not yet 6 in the morning, and May was in her kitchen as he had known she would be, because May Dunnigan was a woman who believed that the world required managing from first light, and those who slept past it were conceding territory. She took one look at him in the doorway, at the smoke-darkened coat and the wet sleeves and the rifle, and said nothing, only poured him coffee and put it in his hands. Sable came downstairs 5 minutes later, drawn by the sound of his voice, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at him with a thoroughness that was not alarm, but was something close to it. "Tell me," she said. He told her, quickly, without embellishment. The fire, Rourke, the confrontation, the hours of work, the barn still standing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her hands flat on the edge of the counter. "Were you hurt?" she said. "No." She looked at his hands. He looked at his hands, too. They were blistered across the palms, from the bucket handles, the skin raw and split at the base of 2 fingers where the wood had cut in over the hours. He had not noticed until she looked. "Sit down," she said. She found May's medicine box without asking where it was kept, which meant May had shown her, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table and cleaned and wrapped his hands with a practical efficiency that was not tender in any performed way, but was completely careful. He watched her work. Her hands were steady and sure, and she did not look up at him while she worked, only at the task in front of her, and there was something in that focused attention and being looked after without theater or excess that Jasper found more difficult to receive than the fire itself had been. "This is Shaw," she said when she had finished. "Rourke doesn't act without Shaw's order," Jasper said. "Shaw found out I went to Santa Fe. He knows the complaint is filed. He knows about the 1863 agreement." He paused. "He's out of time, and he knows it, and so he's out of patience." "Then he will try again," Sable said. "Yes. And next time he will not use Rourke," she said. "Rourke is a man with a career to protect. Next time, Shaw will use men who have nothing to protect." Thomas arrived at the back door 40 minutes after Jasper, with Rosa Vega beside him and the smell of smoke still in both their coats. They had been at the livery when someone rode past shouting about a fire north of town, and Thomas had not waited to saddle properly. Rosa had not waited either. Her father, Esteban Vega, had followed them from the livery on foot, unwilling to let his daughter ride toward trouble alone. He had stood in the dark at the edge of Jasper's yard and watched Thomas pull burning timber away from the barn wall with his bare hands, while Rosa worked the bucket line beside him without being asked. Esteban had not said anything that night. He had simply watched and then ridden home before dawn. He came to the livery at first light and found Thomas still there, cleaning the ash from his hands at the water trough. He stood for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, in the even tone of a man who has revised a judgment and will not make a ceremony of it, "Come to supper on Sunday." He walked back to his shop without waiting for an answer, because the answer was not in question. Thomas told Jasper this in 6 words, standing in May's kitchen doorway with Rosa's hand in his. Jasper looked at his brother's face and then at Rosa, who had the composed and slightly amused expression of a woman who was not surprised by any of it. "Sunday," Thomas said. "Sunday." Jasper agreed. May, who had been standing at the stove with the studied inattention of a woman listening to everything said without turning around, "You should send for Greystone." Both of them looked at her. She turned, holding the coffee pot. "I'm an old woman who has run this boarding house for 23 years, and I know what a town looks like when it is about to divide. This town is about to divide. Half of it will go with Shaw because Shaw has been buying their goodwill for a decade, and the other half will go with whoever stands up first." She refilled both their cups. "A chief arriving to speak for his land is not a war party. It is a lawful assembly of people with a legal claim. The difference matters, and it matters more if people see it clearly before Shaw tells them what to think about it." She set the pot down and went back to her stove. Jasper looked at Sable. Sable was looking at May with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Something that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but was somewhere between them, the expression of someone who has just discovered an unexpected ally in an unexpected place. "Your father," Jasper said. "Is he well enough to travel?" "He is not well enough," Sable said. But he would come. If I sent word that it was time he would come. She paused. He has been waiting for me to send that word. Send it, he said. She looked at him across the table with the full attention he had come to recognize as her way of being present to something important. When Greystone arrives, she said carefully, and when this is resolved, you said you would give me an answer. I know what I said. And you have been to Santa Fe, and you have come back, and the answer is still waiting. He looked at her, the bandaged hands on the table between them, the coffee steam, the morning light. Not much longer, he said. I need to do one thing first. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded. Greystone arrived 4 days later. He came with 6 men, arriving in the early afternoon on a day that had turned unseasonably warm, the first warmth in 2 weeks, as if the weather had decided to offer something civil for the occasion. He rode upright on a gray horse wrapped in a blanket against the cold. He felt more than others now, and when he entered the main street of Serrano Flats, the town received him with a stillness that was different from the stillness that had greeted his daughter. That had been the stillness of surprise. This was the stillness of people who have been told to expect something and are now deciding how to receive it. Jasper met him at the edge of town. He had thought about what to say during the 4 days of waiting, and had arrived at the conclusion that the best thing was the fewest possible words, because Greystone was a man who communicated through what he observed and drew his own conclusions, and would find elaborate speech from a man he had not yet met neither convincing nor respectful. He offered his hand. Greystone looked at it. Then he took it. His grip was still strong, the grip of a man whose body was failing him in specific ways while leaving others intact. "My daughter says you fight fires alone," Greystone said. "I had help," Jasper said. "The horse." Something moved in Greystone's face, not a smile, something that preceded a smile in a man who had not used that particular expression recently. "She also says you went to Santa Fe without asking for anything in return," Greystone said. "The creek is on my land too," Jasper said. "I had my own reasons." "Yes," Greystone said. "That is what I mean." They walked together toward Mays, and Greystone spoke without preamble, the way he did everything. "Before we sit down," he said, "there is something you should know. Shaw found out you had gone to Santa Fe because someone told him." Jasper looked at him. "A young man in our camp," Greystone said. "Not for money. He was afraid. He believed that if your plan failed, the retaliation against our people would be worse than accepting Shaw's terms. He thought he was protecting us." "What happened to him?" Jasper said. "He is still with us," Greystone said. "Fear is not the same as betrayal, though it can wear the same face. I have spoken with him. He understands what his fear cost." A pause. "I tell you this because you are about to become part of our people's circle. You should know that we are not without weakness. Neither is any family." Jasper was quiet for a moment. He thought about that word. Family. He had not used it in 3 years without it meaning something that was gone. "I understand," he said. Greystone nodded once, and they walked on. That evening in May's front room, Jasper and Greystone sat together and talked for 2 hours. Greystone had brought a formal statement written in both languages, signed by every member of the Mescalero Council, setting out the tribe's claim under the 1863 agreement and requesting that the Territorial Land Court confirm its continued validity. It had been prepared with the help of a man in Albuquerque experienced in territorial law. Jasper read it carefully. It was well constructed, more precise in its legal language than his own complaint, while remaining plain enough for a judge who might not be sympathetic. "My daughter," Greystone said at last. He said it without preamble, in the tone of a man who has decided the time for indirection has passed. Jasper waited. "She has not been wrong about a person of consequence," Greystone said. He was repeating what he had written in the letter, and repeating it in person meant he was saying it to Jasper's face, and watching Jasper's face when he heard it. "I read that," Jasper said. "I know you did," Greystone said. "I want to know if you understood it." Jasper looked at the old man across the table, at the careful, patient eyes of a man who was dying, and knew it, and had organized the remaining time available to him around what mattered most. "I understood it," Jasper said. "Then you know what I am asking you." "I know. And tomorrow," Jasper said. "I'll give you both an answer tomorrow. I need tonight." Greystone looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a man assessing whether what he is hearing is an honest need or a delay. Then he nodded. "Tonight," he said. "We are all still here tomorrow." Jasper rode home alone in the dark. He unsaddled the horse and put her in the barn, stopping for a moment to look at the repaired north wall, the new wood pale against the weathered old timber. Thomas had come out 2 days after the fire and spent a full day on it without being asked. He had arrived with lumber in the wagon and said Jasper could argue about it later. Jasper had not argued about it at all. He walked across the yard and stood at the cottonwood. The night was cold and still, and the stars were out in the way they are out in New Mexico in October, not merely present, but urgent, pressing down on the land, with a brightness that made the darkness between them seem almost solid. The 2 flat stones at the base of the tree were pale in the starlight. He stood there for a long time. He thought about Clara. The specific things, not the general fact of her. The way she laughed at things she thought were funny before she laughed at things other people thought were funny without waiting to confirm the response. The particular angle at which she held her head when she was reading. The way she had said his name on ordinary occasions, calling him from one room to another. Just his name. No urgency. Just the casual certainty of someone who knows the person they are calling will come. He thought about William, who had been 4 years old and had been in the world long enough to have opinions about things. William had believed that horses were better than dogs, and that cold biscuits were better than hot ones, and that any story being told was improved by the teller making it longer. He stood with these thoughts the way he had stood with the grief for 3 years, letting it be what it was, without trying to make it into something more manageable or more poetic than it actually was. And then he said aloud for the first time in the dark under the cottonwood with no one to hear it, "I am going to be all right." Not a declaration, not a resolution, just a statement of something he had finally come to know was true. The way you finally know a thing is true when you have carried the uncertainty of it long enough and the carrying has done its work and you are left with what is simply so. The cottonwood moved above him in a small wind off the mountains. The stars continued their ancient business. The land lay quiet and dark and very old around him, older than his grief and older than his happiness and older than everything he had done in it and would do. He went inside. He did not sit in Clara's chair. He sat at the kitchen table where the 2 cups were now together on the shelf as they should be, and he sat there in the dark without building a fire, and he thought about Sable Runningwater, who had ridden into a street full of watching strangers and said what she came to say without adjusting a single thing about herself for any of them, who had told him the truth when he asked questions that had uncomfortable answers, who had sat with him on a sandstone shelf above a valley and let the silence between them be what it was, who had wrapped his burned hands with the complete and careful attention of someone for whom care was not a performance, but a practice. He thought about what she had said when he asked if she would have come without the reasons. "I do not know, but I chose to come. I rode in on my own horse and I said my own words and I carried this box because I chose to carry it." He sat with that for a long time. Then he went to bed and slept. Rourke came back to Shaw's house at 3:30 in the morning. Shaw was still at his desk. He had not gone to bed. He had been sitting with a glass of whiskey he had not drunk, and his wife's questions still in the room with him, the way certain questions stay in a room long after the person who asked them has gone upstairs. "What are you doing, Denton?" Not about the land, not about the railroad, just that. "What are you doing?" Rourke told him that Lorne had not run, had not ridden for help, had simply gotten his horses out and then spent 2 hours alone in the dark with buckets of water until the fire was out and the barn was standing. Then he had sat against the barn wall until dawn and ridden to town. Shaw listened to this and said nothing for a long time. He had told himself a story about Jasper Lorne for 14 months. The story was about a man frozen by grief, holding on to land out of sentiment, unable to see that progress required a kind of practical courage that grief did not permit. It was a story that made Shaw's own actions feel like a form of mercy. He had believed it the way a man believes a story he needs. Lorne, sitting alone in the dark with his buckets, did not fit the story. When Rourke left, Shaw sat for another hour. Then he put on his working coat, the old one, and rode north. He arrived at Jasper's fence in the early morning when the mist was still on the valley floor. He tied his horse at the fence post and knocked, which was something he had not done in 14 months of offers and counter-offers and pressure applied from a careful distance. He knocked because what he had come to do required him to be on the other side of a door asking to be let in. Jasper opened the door. Shaw looked older than the last time Jasper had seen him up close. The particular age that comes not from time, but from the weight of things a man has done that he cannot undo. He was not wearing his good coat. He was wearing the worn working coat of a man who has come to say something and has dressed for honesty rather than effect. "I got the notice from the land office," Shaw said. "I know," Jasper said. "The 1863 agreement." "Yes." Shaw looked past him into the house for a moment, then back. "Can I come in?" Jasper considered this. Then he stepped back from the door. Shaw came inside and stood in the kitchen and looked around it the way a man looks around a place he has not been in for a long time, taking the measure of how it has changed and how it has stayed the same. Jasper did not offer coffee. He waited. "The railroad company received a copy of the land court notice this morning," Shaw said. He said it with the measured flatness of a man reading from an internal ledger of losses. "They have suspended the contract pending resolution of the water rights claim. Suspended, not canceled. But a suspension at this stage is the same as a cancellation because their construction schedule cannot wait 6 weeks for a land court hearing." Jasper said nothing. "I have lost the contract," Shaw said. Simply. No argument in it, no blame. Just the fact. "Yes," Jasper said. Shaw looked at the floor of Jasper's kitchen for a moment, then he looked up. "The water. Rourke organized that. I authorized it. I want you to know I am not going to stand in front of a court and say otherwise." Jasper had not expected this. He let it settle before he responded. "Why?" he said. "Because I have been telling myself a story for the past 2 years," Shaw said, "about progress and about what this land could be and about what was being wasted and what I could do with it." He paused. "I told it well enough that I believed it. I believe most people who do things they shouldn't do believe their story. That doesn't make the story true." He reached inside his coat and put a paper on Jasper's kitchen table. "That's a letter to Rourke's supervisor at the county sheriff's office," Shaw said, "setting out what happened with the water diversions and what happened at your barn and what my role was in both. I've already sent a copy to the land court." Jasper looked at the paper and then at Shaw. "Why?" he said again. Shaw was quiet for a moment. "My wife asked me last night what I was doing," he said. "Not about the land or the railroad or any of it, just what I was doing." He paused. I did not have an answer that satisfied either of us. He picked up his hat from the counter. "I'll restore the diversions," he said. "Both of them. My men will be at the creek by the end of the week. You'll have your full water back before the first snow." He walked to the door. "Denton," Jasper said. Shaw stopped. "The creek water is held in common under the 1863 agreement," Jasper said. "All parties, including you. I will tell the land court that you cooperated voluntarily and that the water is restored. That is worth something in how the court handles the question of your culpability." Shaw stood at the door for a moment with his hat in his hand. "Thank you," he said. He said it without performance, with the plain and slightly surprised tone of a man who did not expect to receive something he had not asked for. He went out and mounted his horse and rode south, and Jasper stood in the doorway and watched him go, and the mist was still on the valley floor, and the morning was very quiet. Jasper rode to town at mid-morning. He found Sable in May's kitchen as he had found her before, though this time she was not writing. She was sitting with her hands around a cup of tea and looking out the window at the main street of Serrano Flats with the focused, unhurried attention that was her way of looking at things. She turned when he came in. He sat down across from her. "Shaw came this morning," he said. He told her what had happened, what Shaw had said, the letter, the promise to restore the water. She listened without interrupting, her expression moving through several things too precisely felt to be easily named. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "My father will want to know," she said. "I'll tell him," Jasper said. "In a moment." She looked at him. He reached into his coat and brought out the thing he had placed there that morning before he left the ranch. The thing he had retrieved from the drawer of the bedside table where he had put it the night he came back from Santa Fe. He set it on the table between them. It was a ring. Simple silver, not new, worn to a soft shine from years of wear and then from 3 years of being kept in a drawer rather than on a finger. Clara's ring. He had taken it from her hand himself at the end because she had asked him to keep